Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we'll be diving back into the history of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. As I mentioned in the last episode, this was a hospital I originally said I would not cover until I was able to go there in person. But with the upcoming 100th episode, I wanted to celebrate with something really exciting. So here it is. Trigger warnings for this episode include outdated and ableist language, outdated racially charged language, mention of suicide, and dependent adult abuse. My main source for this episode is the book, The Haunted History of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum by Sherri Brake. All sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. We left off last week in 1893 when Dr. Crumbacker became superintendent and removed restraints from the hospital. With 943 patients in a hospital that was originally built to house 250, they were severely overcrowded. According to Sherri Brake, there was little more the asylum could do than simply provide custodial care. There was no actual treatment happening for inmates. Dr. Crumbacker complained, quote, "The commitment officials were so sloppy they sometimes did not spell a patient's name twice the same way on their committal paperwork. Additionally, they seldom entered anything concerning what was wrong with patients, leaving asylum staff wondering how to best treat them." End quote. I can't imagine what it would have been like to have gotten a brand new patient with no information on what their condition was and why they were even being sent to the hospital. It seems like that could potentially set someone up for a dangerous situation, for the patient and for staff. The problem was that the asylum had no way to curb the number of admissions that just kept coming and coming. They had to take everyone the counties kept sending their way, even though they were well over capacity. And as we've seen time and again throughout the show, this set the stage for dangerous conditions within the hospital. When patients became aggressive, there were fewer options under the leadership of Dr. Crumbacker. According to Sherri Brake, quote, "Aggressive and violent patients could be expected to be put into isolation or seclusion cells if warranted. The staff was expected to keep patients fed, dressed, and bathed, and above all, under control. The isolation cells were used when all else failed. They are located on the third floor and are an imposing reminder of what must have been pure hell for a patient and a necessary evil for the staff." End quote. I'm curious what they did back then to release patients from seclusion. Today, we have a set of criteria we use when a patient is ready to be released from restraints or seclusion. There isn't a set time or anything the patients need to spend. They could be in restraints or seclusion for 15 minutes or 15 days, but they need to meet the release criteria. Of course, the whole time, they're having their vital signs checked regularly, they're being fed, being taken to the restroom and showered, and so on, all while under a doctor's supervision. I highly doubt the same was being done back in the late 1800s, but who knows? Maybe they would surprise me. Suicides were also quite common around this time. Hanging was a fairly common method of taking one's own life, as sheets and exposed pipes were plentiful. Sherri Brake reports one unusual suicide in 1896 when a patient, quote, "fell into a box with about 3 inches of mortar in it," end quote. And the cause of death was listed as suffocation. Things became so bad that by July 1897, the entire asylum's administration, except for 2 board members, had gone through a complete overhaul. Apparently, many things had needed to change. Dr. W. E. Strathers replaced Dr. Crumbacher. By 1900, Dr. Strathers reported 998 patients at the hospital. He reported a cure rate, and take that with a grain of salt, of 48.8% and a mortality rate of 3.3%. Both of these figures seem almost too good to be true, given the overcrowding situation and understaffing that had been going on for so long. But that's what was reported, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but just know that I am very skeptical. In the last episode, I discussed some of the reasons for admission to the asylum. There are many more reasons, of course. The commonality they share is shame and inability to care for their family members. Sherri Brake says it like this, quote, "Older folks who had no one to take care of them could simply walk into the hospital, sign some papers, and stay there till their dying day. Family members would often be embarrassed about their slow family member and have them become a resident as well. Boys and young men who were caught masturbating could be committed. Children who had ailments such as smallpox, heart disease such as mitral valve prolapse, exhaustion, or tuberculosis could be committed." End quote. Women who were pregnant or suspected to be pregnant, whether that was out of wedlock, through rape or incest, or sent in shame to the asylum. Sherri Brake reports one young woman who was impregnated by her stepfather and who was committed to the asylum by her family due to shame. Her shame. Of course, it wasn't the stepfather who got punished, but rather the victim who would be punished and separated from her family. Young women were also sent to the asylum for amenorrhea, or the unusual absence of a menstrual cycle. Today, we know there are plenty of medical reasons why a young woman may not have started her period by age 15 or so, but none of them mean that she needs to be institutionalized for an indeterminate period of time. But of course, around the turn of the 20th century, that was simply something unacceptable. In a similar vein, older women could be admitted to the asylum for menopausal symptoms. We know there are many physical and emotional changes that take place during menopause for women, and some of them can be very disturbing. Even today, we're still learning to normalize many of these symptoms because many women feel like they just aren't their usual selves. I can only imagine what it must have been like over 100 years ago with less understanding of women's health and certainly less discussion of what to expect. I remember when I was doing crisis work in hospitals, I had a patient come in who was floridly psychotic and screaming. All of a sudden, she leapt out of the bed and just began screaming, "I'm on fire! I'm on fire! Oh God, I'm on fire!" And the doctor's response was to give her antipsychotics, which, to be fair, wasn't a bad call. She was acutely psychotic. But I pulled him aside afterward and said that given her age, she was probably also experiencing an early hot flash and just didn't know what it was. To her, it was probably a new sensation, and this was her way of dealing with the distress. She was the right age, relatively low cognitive functioning, and acutely psychotic. The puzzle pieces just added up to me. The doctor seemed to agree, but there wasn't a whole lot we could do for her in the emergency department. We made a referral and hoped for the best. All that to say that if they didn't have the same framework back in the 19th century, they probably would have just seen a manic woman who needed containment. The treatments that were available at the asylum were minimal at best. By the late 19th century, music therapy was introduced as a way to calm patients down. According to Sherri Brake, quote, concerts and dances were held in the auditorium located on the third floor in the main hospital. Plays would take place on occasion with patients and staff acting out the roles, end quote. As with most hospitals of this time, the primary mode of treatment was through work. Patients would work in the kitchen or with simple chores on the wards or in landscaping. When the coal mine was operating, some patients became excellent coal miners. And it's important to note here that coal mining is extremely hazardous work to put vulnerable patients in without their consent. The hospital will become increasingly self-sufficient, largely in part through the efforts of free patient labor. Also typical of the time was that staff would reside on the grounds of the hospital. They worked 12 to 16-hour-long days and had about 1 day off per month. At the end of the 19th century, staff earned an average of $25 per month. According to Sherri Brake, quote, a typical day began before 6 a.m. with staff rising from their beds. Nurses' apartments were located on the third floor of the main hospital building. Doctors' apartments were on the second floor. Some of the nurses' rooms resembled dorm rooms at a college, complete with the sharing of bathrooms. Meals would be eaten at the asylum in a special dining room until the practice was eventually stopped. An increase in pay was given after the meals were discontinued, end quote. And it's no wonder that in most hospitals, nurses would be expected to be single because how would they have time to go home to their families if they only had 1 day off per month? How would they be expected to tend to their home and everything else a wife at the time was expected to do? There would be little time for home life and patient treatment. One of the early treatments used at the asylum was bloodletting, although it's unclear how long it was actually used there. Bloodletting, or the process where a physician would open a vein with a lancet and drain the blood into a bowl, was believed to cleanse the body of impurities. It was used in the early days of the Weston Asylum. Another treatment used was injecting malaria into patients with syphilis in an attempt to raise the overall body temperature and kill off the syphilitic spirochetes. It was believed that this would also prevent psychosis caused by late-stage syphilis, although how effective it actually was, I'm not so sure. We know in a system this large, with this many vulnerable patients and this few staff, that abuse is bound to occur. A scandal broke out in 1899 that shocked staff, family members, and the general public. Sherri Brake describes the incident here. Dr. Strathers, the current superintendent at the asylum, was being charged with questionable conduct with female patients. He had 6 children with his wife and was of good standing at the hospital, but apparently, and by some accounts and testimony, was allegedly a ladies' man, end quote. Of course, whenever you have someone in a position of authority allegedly taking advantage of dependent adults, and that's assuming they were adults, that is unclear in the records, there's a lot that can be done to protect the person in charge and scapegoat the vulnerable victims. But there were witnesses to the alleged abuse, according to the records. The final order from the Weston State Hospital investigation reads as follows, quote, on motion, it is ordered that the board proceed to consider the charges filed against the superintendent and all evidence presented in connection therewith, and after mature consideration, the board is of the opinion that the prosecution has failed to sustain the charges so filed against said W.E. Strathers, superintendent, and find him not guilty as charged. End quote. not guilty, even though there were witnesses to the abuse. That means that the victims of whatever he was charged with had to continue to live with and be treated under the care of their abuser. And sure, we can play devil's advocate. Why not? Let's assume he was innocent of all charges and had been wrongfully accused by paranoid patients. In the minds of those patients, he remained their abuser, which can be just as painful. Whatever the truth was, Dr. Strathers was gone from Weston Asylum within a year of the accusations against him, but the toll it took on the hospital would take years to overcome. Dr. Strathers was replaced by Dr. A. H. Kunst as superintendent in 1900. There isn't a lot of history available for the next decade. Presumably, the hospital continued operating free of scandals and other major incidents. It continued taking on more and more patients than it could reasonably accommodate. On a ward of approximately 52 patients, there were generally 2 staff members in charge of monitoring everyone, which was grossly neglectful, even for the best and most competent staff members. And to give some sort of perspective, today on a unit of 50 patients, there are a minimum of 6 level of care staff, so meaning psychiatric technicians and nurses. And that excludes clinicians like doctors and therapists. 2 staff for over 50 patients would burn out the staff members and underserve the patients entirely, and potentially create a very dangerous environment. In 1913, the hospital underwent another name change. You may remember from the last episode that the hospital changed from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum to the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane in 1863. In 1913, it changed once again, this time to Weston State Hospital. This was around the time that most asylums around the U.S. were changing their names to lose the archaic terms of insane and asylums for the more preferred nomenclature of state hospital. The name change, however, didn't do much to change the stigma attached to the facilities. A report on the hospital came out in 1916 in the midst of World War I, depicting the self-sufficient nature of the hospital. The report reads as follows, quote, "The grounds belonging to the hospital contain about 335 acres and front about 2,000 feet on the West Fork River opposite the town of Weston and extend back to the north to a depth sufficient for this acreage. With the exception of the site on which the buildings are located, which extends back from the river about 800 feet, the land is very steep and entirely unsuitable for tillage. A very small portion of it is used for gardening, but most was used for grazing. There are 2 producing gas wells upon the property, supplying abundant gas for all the needs of the institution, which were discovered in an effort to secure water by boring deep wells. The water supply is something of a problem with this institution, because the only source of supply is the West Fork River. The recent erection of a very large reservoir upon a high point of the hill in the rear building has solved the question of storage. So much filtering is needed, however, that it is difficult to get the water entirely free from sediment. There are some shallow drilled wells upon the premises, which are of considerable value in times of drought." The report goes on to give a brief history of the hospital, which you already know from the previous episode. However, it does give a rundown of the buildings on the property, which had expanded by 1916. Remember that the main building of the hospital was finally completed in 1881. So these were all buildings that had been added since that time. And again, Trigger warning here for outdated and racially charged language. Number 1, the Atkinson Building, erected in 1897, 3 stories in height, containing 3 wards, all used for male patients. 2, a 3-story brick building containing 2 wards, one for male colored patients, the other for female colored patients. 3, a laundry building occupied by the laundry with a plumbing shop and a power plant in the basement. 4, an electric powerhouse, a 1-story brick building containing the electric light machinery, ice plant, and 3 cold storage rooms. 5, a patient's kitchen, 45 by 75 feet, equipped with the necessary outfit for the cooking, which must be done on a large scale for such an institution. 6, a sick patient's kitchen. 7, a bake shop, a 1-story brick building containing oven, dough mixer, engine, and other necessary utensils. 8, a storeroom, a 2-story brick building, the lower floor containing the main storeroom, clothes cutting room, and sewing room. The upper floor is used as an attendant's dining room with kitchen attached. This building is in bad condition. 9, a morgue. The morgue is a stone building used for the reception of the bodies of patients dying in the house. 10, a hose house, a small frame building containing all the hose and firefighting apparatus. 11, greenhouses. 12, barn. This is a frame structure. Part of it is used for horses and the remainder for cows. So this gives you an idea about how many structures were on the property after the turn of the century. And I'm struck by the storeroom that was already listed as in bad condition by 1916. Of course, we know what was developing behind the scenes around this time. Illness, namely influenza and tuberculosis. Most notable is the influenza epidemic of 1918 to 1919. Sherri Brake points out that the Public Health Service did not require states to report influenza cases before September 27, 1918. So the first recorded case in West Virginia is on that date, although there were likely cases long beforehand. Public places began to shut down. People were advised to stay indoors and avoid physical contact with others. Brake says, quote, "Across the state, fear was settling in, and with good cause. West Virginia University was closed during the epidemic, and a fraternity house on campus was turned into an emergency hospital. In Morgantown, theaters and churches were closed and public meetings banned. Closure of schools and prohibition of public gatherings likewise were of doubtful value. The use of face masks to protect the wearer against infection had its advocations, but the poor and rural located had no means to get access to them. In the asylum, close quarters worked against your chances of not contracting the influenza. The disease hit coal mining areas harder than other regions. By October, so many West Virginians were either ill themselves or caring for those suffering from the influenza that a local committee estimated that only 20% of people were able to attend their jobs outside the home. Only 2 mail carriers, for example, were available in Martinsburg to sort and pass out the mail. Grave diggers and undertakers also found themselves overwhelmed with the demand for graves and proper burial. For several weeks in major cities in the state, grave diggers found themselves facing a backload of at least 24 graves, which needed to be dug by hand each day." End quote. There were so many patients who died from the disease during this time that they had to bury more than one patient in a grave at the time. Known as, quote, double-deckers, anywhere from 2 to 4 bodies would be stacked up on top of one another in one grave. This was thought of as both time and cost-effective, given the circumstances. At the same time, and in years to come, were outbreaks of tuberculosis, also known as the White Plague or the White Death. According to Sherri Brake, quote, early outbreaks in the United States were started by the drinking of unpasteurized cow milk. Poor living conditions, crowded environs, inclement weather, and lack of sunlight are all contributing factors to the spread of this contagious disease. Physicians typically blamed both the poor themselves and their ramshackle-like houses and tent cities for the spread of the dreaded disease. People ignored public health campaigns to limit the spread of contagious diseases, such as the prohibition of spitting on the streets. Health officials suggested mandatory quarantines, which separated families from TB-stricken loved ones, but these were often ignored. End quote. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole about the history of tuberculosis treatment. I'll keep it short, but I thought it might be of interest to you. Did you know that people used to think tuberculosis, which we know used to be called consumption, people used to think it was hereditary until about 1868, when a French scientist named Jean-Antoine Villemin proved that it was contagious? And it was an American physician, Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau, who promoted isolation as a means of sparing the healthy and healing the sick. He came up with the idea of isolation after having watched his older brother die of tuberculosis and catching the disease himself. He left his medical practice to basically go to his favorite resort in the Adirondacks to die. But instead, he regained his strength due to his healthy diet and outdoor exercise. And when he recovered, he conducted experiments on tubercular rabbits in his lab at the cottage, and this seemed to confirm his belief. In 1885, he welcomed his first group of patients to his sanatorium in the woods. The experiment was successful, and sanatoriums began to emerge as treatment options around the world. In the 1920s and 1930s, tuberculosis cases began to increase significantly at Weston State Hospital, so the need for a sanatorium on site also began to rise. A large brick sanatorium was constructed in 1940 on the south end of the property, far from the main building, with the hope of keeping contagion low. The building was designed so that plenty of airflow would get in and patients would have access to enough sunlight. It was unclear from my research how many patients died of tuberculosis at Weston over the years. As tuberculosis was ravaging the hospital, another danger was also brewing. You may recall that these old Kirkbride buildings, as sturdy as they were also extreme fire hazards because of their wood interiors and poor ventilations. In 1871, Superintendent Camden had been concerned about the risk of fire and had attempted to improve the ventilation throughout the asylum. 60 years later, however, things weren't much better. So when on Thursday, October 3rd, 1935, a patient on the 4th floor awoke just after the usual dinner bell to find himself surrounded by flames, he didn't know what to do. So he ran to the window that was covered in bars and somehow mustered the strength to bend the bars with his bare hands just far enough for him to escape out the window to where the firefighters were waiting for him with a ladder. Sherri Brake notes, quote, after the fire was out, many patients no longer had a ward that was livable, So staff set about securing a location for the displaced to stay. Around 300 patients were transferred to Jackson's Mill, which is a local 4-H camp. The total in the ward was around 390, but about 80 to 90 were able to stay at the hospital. They were all able to return to the asylum once the wards were repaired. End quote. Altogether, the damage sustained was between $150,000 to $200,000, and firefighters came from Weston and nearby Buchanan and Clarksburg to fight the flames. Initially, the cause of the fire was believed to be defective electrical wiring, but later an 18-year-old patient named Forrest Culver confessed to setting the fire. He had been at the hospital since he was 12 years old. A few days after the fire, another smaller fire was set. Again, an act of arson. This time, it was a copycat act, since Forrest Culver was locked in solitary confinement. Staff were able to quickly put this fire out, and no injuries were reported. But then there was another fire, and another, and another, and another, for a total of 6 small fires. They clearly had another arsonist on their hands. But then things got quiet, for a while at least. Then on November 29th, another fire broke out. This time, they released bloodhounds. The dogs led officials back to a patient at the hospital, 16-year-old Earl James Lloyd, who had also been at the asylum since he was 12 years old. Although he initially denied his role in the arsons, he eventually confessed to setting all 7 fires and admitted he had keys to the entire south wing. He said he lit the fires for the thrill and excitement. This, of course, was very dangerous, considering that the census of the hospital was increasing every year. By 1938, the census was up to 1,661. That same year, a survey was conducted by Dr. Jones Granville through the Survey of Mental Hospital Committees, and the end result did not leave a favorable review. The survey was the, quote, beginning of consideration being given to closing the 88-year-old hospital for a more modern, state-of-the-art facility, end quote. In addition to the mentally ill, the survey found that the facility was housing, quote, epileptics, alcoholics, drug addicts, and the non-educable mental defectives, end quote. Remember that by the 1930s, these groups of mental disorders typically had their own facilities, so the survey was pointing out that they were unnecessarily housing people who could be housed elsewhere. And it's significant here that this is the first mention of closing the facility in 1938. And you know what? I think I will pause the story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum on that note. And that means the next time will be the 100th episode. Oh my gosh, you guys, 100 episodes. I can hardly believe it. Please let me know what you think I should do for 100 episodes. I feel like I should do something fun. Let me know let me know in the Facebook group or on the Instagram page what you think I should do to celebrate 100 episodes. I bet you'll have lots of creative ideas, and I really want to hear them. Or send me an email at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. Let me know what you think I should do for 100 episodes. If you have any ideas of how I could celebrate on the show or off the show or on my social media pages, let me know your creative ideas. I want to hear them. So I hope you had a wonderful holiday season. I know it's not quite over yet, so I hope you're continuing to celebrate and enjoy with your loved ones, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. Please take the show with you wherever you're traveling. And of course, feel free to follow the show on Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. Join the Facebook group Behind the Walls Podcast. Feel free to support the show on Patreon or on Beacons. But of course, the best way you can support the show is to rate and review wherever you are listening and to share the show with a friend. So thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it so much more than you know. And as always, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can till you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.